How you doing? Good. You good? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you this afternoon. We've just completed our weekly cabinet meeting. I wanted to, in my regular availability, touch upon some of the things that have happened in the past couple of days and, of course, focus on the next couple of weeks. We are assembled here on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, and it is a real privilege and opportunity to say to all British Columbians how grateful I am for the work that you've been doing to help bend the curve here in British Columbia. Dr. Henry and Minister Dix will be out later today with new numbers, and there are some challenges among those numbers. You'll be aware of an outbreak in a poultry facility in Vancouver, which is disappointing on a whole host of levels, but it will skew our numbers in the short term, and Dr. Henry will explain and put some context on that for everyone. But it highlights, I think, how important it is as we look to that period when we come out from underneath the restrictions that have been in place, that we ensure that workplaces are indeed safe. We all know that the economy is the people of British Columbia, and if the people of British Columbia are not safe in their workplace, if the people of British Columbia do not feel safe accessing public transit or accessing goods and services within the economy, they're going to stay home, they're going to continue to be fearful. We need to come out of this hopeful and optimistic. And I am hopeful for a variety of reasons. Firstly, I look at the businesses that are now retooling to manufacture protective equipment here in British Columbia, so we're not so dependent on foreign supply chains. I'm grateful for my neighbours and neighbours across British Columbia who are coming together to help each other, to send a signal to those frontline workers how grateful we are that they're working in the healthcare sector to protect patients and to protect all of us, as well as those that are working every day to make sure that the things we need are available in a safe and reasonable way. And I also want to thank the musicians and the artists who are taking this time of reflection and isolation to build on the talents that they have and share those electronically and virtually with the rest of British Columbia and indeed the rest of the world. These are inspiring times as well as challenging times, and we need to focus on both of those elements as we go forward. As we fight COVID-19, we have to be focused on making sure that we're creating a better British Columbia. In concert with the federal government, we've been making a series of announcements about how we're providing relief for people. This week, we announced property tax relief for businesses and local governments. We established a BC Business Hotline so people can call in, businesses can call in to see what programs are available for them. New mental health programs for post-secondary students who are concerned about the loss of a year, the loss of a program as we fight through this. And we've also put in place emergency resources for people with disabilities, as well as emergency resources for others across the board. We put in place restrictions on price gouging. We put in place technology grants for students so that they can access the technologies that we need in a virtual environment. And we've announced, Minister Dix announced 3 new primary care centres, urgent primary care centres. Yesterday, he talked about Vernon, Abbotsford, and Castlegar, and I'm happy to announce that on the 27th of April, a new urgent primary care centre will be opening up here in Victoria. The James Bay UPCC will be on Michigan Street, just in the James Bay Community Project behind the legislature. Urgent primary care centres are part and parcel of our response to COVID-19. Certainly, we talked about programs for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities on Monday. Today's announcement of more primary care centres also speaks to delivering services for people. We need them certainly during a time of pandemic, but we need them more than ever when people are fearful and concerned about their personal health and well-being as well as their loved ones. The primary care centres are going to be critical in achieving that. I want to also just remind everyone that as we go forward, we need to adhere to the directives we're hearing from Dr. Henry and the public health officials right across the province. If we are going to be successful, we have to hold fast. And again, I ask British Columbians to recommit to each other, to recommit to us moving forward together. There will be some challenges, there's no question, but we are seeing light at the end of the tunnel. In the days ahead, Cabinet will be considering how we phase in a return to normalcy. We've been working on that from the beginning, and every day we get new information. I want to lift my hands and give props to the restaurant sector who are working now, before we come out from underneath this, on better ways to ensure that people who work in the hospitality sector are safe, and most importantly, that the services or the food that they provide will be safe as well. This is not a magic bullet that will come from government. It will be, again, cooperation amongst all of us, the people of British Columbia, who are, as I said, the economy of British Columbia. The only way forward is to do it together. The only way we will all feel safe is if we are all pulling in the same direction. Thanks for that, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
A reminder to reporters on the line, please press *1 to queue up for questions. If you do have a follow-up question, you can press *1 to re-queue after you've asked, and if time permits, we will get back to you. Also, unmute your microphones. You won't be audible until we call your name. Our first question is from Maria Weisgarber at CTV.
Thank you. Premier, I'm just asking about the personal protective equipment allocation in regards to pharmacies. I know the Pharmacy Association has asked for allocation to pharmacies to be a priority. Obviously, they understand that what's available will initially go to places like hospitals and other health facilities, but it sounds as though they're working with the province to see what might be available once those PPE needs are filled at that level. I'm just wondering where we're at with bringing in enough equipment for the very front line, and where that might leave pharmacies in terms of being able to be allocated some supply.
Thank you for the question. And of course, we had not good news yesterday that the federal government was unable to get a shipment out of Shanghai that they had anticipated. We have been meeting with success in our efforts to procure PPE, and we'll continue to do that. But as I said in my introductory remarks, there are manufacturers that are emerging across the country. I talked to Premier Doug Ford in Ontario, which has often been characterized as the manufacturing heartland of Canada, largely because of autos, but now they're retooling to meet the needs of today. And I'm very pleased with the progress that's being made there. I get regular updates from Premier Ford. But right here in British Columbia, companies are now retooling to provide the PPE, the protective equipment that we'll need, not just in acute care facilities, not just in our long-term care facilities, but also across the economy. Pharmacies are obviously a high point for us, and Minister Dix will be working to apportion those resources as is in the best interest of delivering health services to British Columbians. Obviously, as you said in your preamble, our focus is first and foremost with our frontline workers. There's a whole host of other workers in the economy that are going to be requiring and using, in fact, today, PPE. We need to make sure we're apportioning that equitably. As I've said before, we are not the only people on the planet looking for this equipment. Everybody is. We hear horror stories from other jurisdictions. That's not our experience here, but it's prudent management, I think, that's kept us out of that glue, and we're going to continue to manage that resource prudently until we have such a surplus that we'll be able to spread it more equitably across the broader economy.
Our next question is from Tanya Fletcher.
Hi, Premier. Thank you for this. I'm wondering if you can update us on some of the earliest measures that the province announced, specifically the rent supplement. Is that money flowing? And also the emergency benefit for workers. Have any checks been sent out there? Because we've been hearing from some who say it's been a struggle to access help. Appears the application isn't available online yet. When will that happen?
Well, firstly, the emergency benefit that we'll be providing, the $1,000, will be flowing in May. That was our expectation, and those processes are being worked on. If there are glitches, I'm happy to hear about it, and I'll take that back to Minister James. When it comes to the rent supplement, I know we've issued thousands of checks to assist renters. There's more to do, and we've got another month coming up. We're working with BC Housing to make sure that that system works effectively. Again, I bring up the challenges that we have had and the federal government has had in retooling our activities as governments. Normally we provide services. There are checks for certain activities, and that's a limited amount of activity. Now we're expanding that. The federal government is expanding that. Some of them cost shared, some of them not. And so we're working as best we can, retooling our own systems internal to government to make sure that we can provide a service that we've never provided before. And there are going to be challenges, but I'm hopeful that people will continue to have patience and we'll get dollars into people's hands as quickly as we possibly can.
Our next question is from Richard Zisman.
Premier, ICBC announced last week that cancellation fees would be waived, but it's still being held up by the BCUC, and we're hearing from people frustrated that they're trying to cancel their insurance to save money, to pay for things like groceries and rent, and haven't saved that money yet. And does that concern you? And two, if the province is able to give a rebate, should people be concerned that that will be held up as well?
Well, certainly Minister Eby has been focused on ICBC since we were sworn in as a government. It's well known, and you've covered it extensively yourself, as have others on the call, the challenges that ICBC has created for our finances. We're continuing to focus on that. The longer-term solution to ICBC is still underway. We plan to have product changes in place for next year, and that's where the significant savings will be found for the traveling public. I think the Utilities Commission role is an important one. We want to make sure that there is an independent body doing the checking on whether this is viable for the corporation. These are things that have happened in the past, whether it's with BC Hydro or ICBC. So the Commission has a role to play. I'm hopeful that they'll be accelerating their efforts to make sure that we have these dollars available to people as quickly as possible. It's Wednesday afternoon. We announced the program on Friday, so I don't think that's a long time to wait, but I understand people are anxious. They want to make sure that they're not wasting a penny in these very difficult times. So we're doing our best to accelerate these processes, but doing it in a way that's not reckless and has something that we can cross-check to ensure that we're on the right track.
Next, we have Victor Kaiser.
Hi, Premier. Just wondering on, a lot of these programs and access and benefits, everything's online. We've heard, concerns from people that, either they don't have access to the internet or their access is rather spotty, particularly in rural areas here in the interior. I'm not sure there's any plans to, kind of fix those problems or expedite it, whether temporarily or permanently, so people have access to some of the online information that's out there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, and I'll take it into another sector, if you don't mind, and come back to a direct answer to your question. We've been providing resources in the K-12 system as we move to virtual education to make sure that every family has access to the technology that they'll need to participate fully in virtual classrooms. That's an area that has been, we hadn't contemplated. You have this expectation that everyone has access to computers. That's not the case, certainly for young families. And so we want to make sure that we're providing the tools that students need so they can continue learning. Similarly, we've had a broadband initiative run out of the Ministry of Citizen Services. That's overseen by Minister Ann Kang right now, and I've given direction to Ann to accelerate the expansion of our broadband program into rural and remote communities. This ties in nicely with the announcement we made around health delivery in rural and remote communities. The isolation, the distances of British Columbia are vast. And they're made all the more vast when we think about the challenges of accessing services in a time of pandemic. So this has been a wake-up call for all of us to understand that although we think of ourselves as a small jurisdiction on the clinging on to the west coast of North America, looking out to the Pacific Ocean, we have vast distances, and those distances oftentimes are not covered by the technologies that we anticipate we're going to be able to access in urban centres. Those people who live in urban centres who have not got the technologies they need to access services, we're doing our level best to make sure MLA's offices are available to help people if they don't have the technological skills or the equipment to access programs. Those offices remain open, all political parties. These are non-partisan offices. The MLA may be a New Democrat or a Liberal or a Green, but the staff are there to serve the public regardless of how they vote, and that's a key function for our constituency offices. They remain available. Service BC could have more people working as we start to fan out into a broader workforce and more of the economy opening up, but we're not there yet, but we'll get there shortly.
Our next question is from Rob Shaw.
Hey, Premier. Washington State Governor Jay Inslee had a televised address last night to provide the roadmap for the state's economic return. It sounds like Saskatchewan's Premier is going to do that tonight as well. We've heard Minister Dix here say that we're tracking kind of for early to mid-May details. And I wondered, do you plan on addressing the province with a roadmap before then, or are we looking at as much as 3 weeks from now waiting to kind of hear a similar address from you that we're seeing from from some other states and provinces?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I know Governor Inslee made his announcements yesterday. I'll be speaking with him on Friday, and I look forward to getting some insights from him on how he is going to respond to a range of issues outside of the cross-border issues that are always concern to us here in BC, and a range of other issues. But I think the public can expect that I'll have something to say about how we open up sooner than the middle of May, but we need to be guided by the science. And although, as I said in my opening remarks, we've seen some very positive indicators in the numbers that Dr. Henry presents daily and will present again today, the outbreak in the poultry facility is a warning call that we can't get too complacent. We need to make sure that our workplaces are safe, even those essential workplaces. And I'll be working with the WorkSafe executive and board members, as well as Minister Baines, later today to talk about how we ensure that when we open up, our workplaces are free of risk to employees, and most importantly, free of risk to those citizens who access those workplaces for whatever reason they may find. And so I'll be talking about that, Rob, but I don't want to talk about it before we're ready to go. And I don't want to give false hope to people that there's an early date for us here in British Columbia. I didn't hear an early date from Governor Inslee, and I don't expect we'll hear an early date from Premier Moe. I know that in our regular conversations with premiers across the country, we talk about where we are in that curve, and some are more optimistic than others. I have been historically optimistic. I remain so, but I want to make sure that we're not getting ahead of ourselves, and I don't want British Columbians to take comfort in the early successes we've had in the past couple of weeks, when we know examples like the poultry farm, the outbreak at the Mission Correctional Facility create problems for us over time. What I know for sure is that British Columbians don't want to give up the progress we've made for an early start that will put us back on our heels and perhaps in further restrictions as the summer proceeds. We want to make sure that we have a seamless integration back into as much normalcy as we can find, and I'll be making significant announcements about that directly to the people of British Columbia when the time is right.
Next, we have a question from Les Lane.
Well, thanks. Premier, how come the regional park system can stay open and handle social distancing? The Capital Regional District says they're getting 90% compliance, but the entire provincial park system is shut down. Do you think that provincial closure needs a rethink, given how critical it is by now for young families to get out and run around in the fresh air?
Well, I agree. I accept your premise, Les. But again, Dr. Henry's been pretty clear. She's not suggesting people hide under their bed. She's saying if you're going to get out and enjoy the outdoors, do so close to home. The more travel people do to get to regional parks or provincial parks creates more risk for other citizens. And it's about pulling together. And we'll have a plan to open up public spaces in the days and weeks ahead. And I encourage people to hold to that and try and get that outdoor time as you can, where you can. There are regional trails. There are a host of places where people can go, and people are exercising physical distancing. And I've heard from many of my friends that they hear about it if they get too close. So I think there's, it's not just dogs that are barking at people who get too close. I think people are barking as well. And that speaks to the frustration that people are experiencing, but also the earnestness with which people are adhering to physical distancing. And if somebody gets within 6 feet or 2 meters, depending on what decade you were born in, I think people will respond to that. And I have confidence that the public who are going outside are doing so responsibly, and we'll see how we go from here on opening up provincial parks in the days and weeks ahead.
Next, we have a question from Keith Baldry.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for this. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives today has a report out saying that the pandemic crisis and the impact on long-term care homes shows that we have to get away from the for-profit model and stop the contracting out. Do you envision those changes taking place over time?
Well, you'll know, Keith, covering these issues for many, many years, that we have always, as a political party, had concerns about the direction that long-term care took at the turn of the century back in 2001, 2002. And I think some of the challenges that we anticipated are being graphically highlighted during this time of pandemic. And we want to make sure, and Minister Dix has already taken steps to ensure that we don't have healthcare workers having to work in 2 and 3 facilities to meet their monthly expenses. And I think that you can anticipate that will be, that in fact you can be certain that will be the norm going forward. There are a range of things that we're learning right now through this pandemic that are going to change how we do business. I use the example of making sure that our K-12 system is providing technology to all students, or access to that technology. The computer labs of the 1990s are not the tablets of the 2020s. So technology is becoming cost effective. We need to make sure we're distributing that to as many people as possible. And so what the world looks like in the months ahead is not going to be what the world looked like in the rearview mirror. And I think that at the end of the day will be positive. We're learning how to better care for each other. The primary care facilities that we're announcing, the one in James Bay opening next week, are examples of how delivering services is not the same as it was in the 1950s. And we all are getting our head around that, and mostly for the better.
Next, we have Lisa Yuzda.
I'm going to follow up on what Keith said there. With this change going forward, right now, what the Centre for Policy Alternatives said is essentially there's kind of a double dipping, that the province is giving money to these for-profit centres like they're paying union wages, which they're not, and now they're getting bumped up. Will we get to see a formal accounting from them as taxpayers for you as government, that we get to see how they're spending the money that they're getting from the government?
Well, I'll do a bit of a retrospective here. Before the last election, the seniors advocate, Isabel McKenzie, did a very comprehensive report on the delivery of services for seniors in long-term care facilities. And she highlighted how the vast majority, I think it was 80+% of the facilities, were not meeting basic minimum standards. Minister Dix, in his mandate letter from me, set about resolving that to the best of his ability in the old world. Now that we're in a new world and we see the catastrophic consequences of outbreaks in our long-term care facilities and the terrible loss of lives and loved ones no longer being able to, and in some cases no longer being able to say goodbye to their parents or their grandparents, is something that we do not want to ever see again. And so, Minister Dix, I'm very confident we'll have more to say about this as we come forward. We're focusing on the day-to-day, but the long-term plan for our healthcare system, whether it's through primary care units as the ones that we've described today, whether it's ensuring that we have capacity at all times within our acute care system for the advent of situations like we find ourselves in today, or how we deliver services for seniors and expand our continuing care facility in a time when our population is aging and the number of seniors who will be accessing those services will increase. We need to make sure they're as efficient as possible, as cost-effective as possible, but most importantly, as safe as possible.
Next, we have a question from Mary Brooke.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for taking my question. My question is about UBCM, and so far they seem to have been serving as kind of a clearinghouse for government information and playing it safe. But every municipality has distinct needs, and some are doing a good job of trying to address local needs, and others maybe not. So how would you see UBCM doing a more effective job of leadership for their members and their communities during COVID-19?
I spoke with Maya Tate, the president of UBCM, just this week. She also happens to be a mayor in my community, a mayor of Souk. We have a long-standing relationship, and she, as the president of UBCM, I believe is doing is the best she can to make sure that the programs that we're announcing are well known and understood across the province in large and small communities. Weekly conference calls are held with the UBCM and Minister Robinson about how we can better work together on delivering services for people. Is it uneven across the board? Of course it is. Similarly, we have challenges with the federal government because the capacity that we need to provide services in this environment is brand new. We are creating it as we go, and that's the same challenge that municipalities have. They have had a precipitous decline in revenues, just as the province and the federal government has, just as businesses have. And so municipalities need to find ways to provide services to continue to be available for citizens, and they are constrained by a whole host of issues around being able to borrow, being able to run deficits. All of those things are being discussed with Minister Robinson, and Minister Maya Tate is leading that for UBCM, and I think she's doing so ably. Is it equitable across the board in terms of understanding and delivery? No, but that's always been thus, and we just have to work as hard as we can to make sure we're lifting everyone up as best we can.
Next, we have Dirk Meissner.
Hey, Premier, a little earlier you said you were disappointed with the results of from the chicken plant. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about your disappointment and concerns about what has happened there, or what is happening there.
Well, Dr. Henry will have more details on the chapter and verse, what the chronology was at the poultry facility. But as I understand it, it's a federally inspected facility. It's not unlike the Cargill beef facility in Alberta. And so there are federal inspectors that are engaged all the time. They would understand the situation with our public health directives. They would also understand the basic mandate of WorkSafe, which is you shouldn't be going to work if you're sick. And what we discovered at the poultry facility is that there were a number of employees, a bunch of complications that we need to address. People who are concerned that they won't be able to meet their expenses end up going to work even if they've got a sniffle, much less if they've got COVID-19. And I don't think there's a person watching this conference right now that hasn't had the experience of a co-worker showing up when they should better have stayed in bed. And myself, I've certainly come to work when I've had a runny nose and shouldn't have done so. And I think we'll all have a different approach to that now that we have an understanding of the consequences of COVID-19 and other viruses that may well be waiting to arrive on our shores. That's why it's important that we put in place a framework so that through WorkSafe, where we can have safe workplaces and an understanding that sick pay is there not just to give extra dollars to people who are ill, but perhaps ensure that those workers don't come to work because they know they're not going to forego their wages for the day. So we're going to have a dialogue across sectors to those areas who don't provide sick pay for their employees. We did bring in some changes to employment standards to make sure that people wouldn't lose their job for not coming to work. But I think obviously what the lesson that I learned from the limited information I have on the poultry facility is that workers were coming to work because they were fearful that they would lose wages and not be able to meet their expenses. We can't have people putting others at risk for fear of economic consequences for themselves. That's irresponsible, but we have a collective responsibility to deal with that, and I expect WorkSafe and Minister Baines and I will be talking about that very issue later today.
Next question is from Sean Eckford.
Thank you. Mr. Premier, you talked Monday about BC Ferries and transit and trying to get some federal financial help on that front, and we're looking at the numbers that they're losing in revenue every day. If that federal help doesn't come, do you have any assurance for coastal communities that when we start to get back to normal, that is going to include getting our ferry service levels back to where they used to be without having to resort to something like reopening the fare cap and such?
Well, very good question. And I spoke with Minister Freeland this morning, the Deputy Prime Minister, reinforced my view that I've been making the ferry argument for some time. I'll continue to do that, but also focusing today more explicitly on public transit, because public transit affects major cities and small cities right across the country. And the federal government contributes significantly to the running of those systems through capital investments, but not a great deal in operations. And the operating costs are what we see disappear when the fare box is empty, whether it be ferries, transit, or TransLink. So I made the arguments again today to Minister Freeland. She heard me. She's been very good in listening and not having a closed mind to opening up ideas about how we can collaborate during this difficult time. All orders of government have a role to play in making sure we can move around effectively when we start to come out from underneath the restrictions that we've been working under. And when it comes to smaller routes, Minister Trevena, who is an islander, lives on Quadra Island, has been relentless in her pursuit of a fair way for us to manage the challenges that BC Ferries are facing in terms of their fare box and their declining revenues. And we do not want to see those smaller routes abandoned, and we don't want to have a long debate about bringing them back on. And that's why I've been focused on this with the federal government. We need to make sure that we all understand, provincial, federal, and municipal, regional districts, we all understand that we're in this together, and we have to find ways to maintain these things that are so important to us, not just for coastal communities when it comes to ferries, but also buses in suburban Vancouver or in Prince George and Kamloops. All of these things have to be thought of as in the interest of our economy, going back to that fundamental principle that people make up the economy, people need services, people need transportation services if they're going to be able to continue to participate in lifting up everyone's quality of life. And Minister Freeland gets that. The challenge is that there's no end of the ask, whether it be me asking the federal government or the municipal government's asking me and citizens asking all of us to make sure we're doing what we can to put people at the center of this challenge. And that's been our objective from the beginning, and we'll continue to work cooperatively but forcefully with our partners to make sure that we make the arguments that the things that we need in BC are also needed in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, in Quebec, and in the Maritimes. And as long as the federal government continues to have an open mind to how we work together on these challenges, good ideas coming from every quarter, we're going to be fine. And that's the intent and the spirit of our engagements, but we need to see some tangible results for people as well.
Our last question today is from Brishti Basu.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for taking my question. I was just wondering, will the provincial government be responding to the letter signed by Vancouver Island mayors calling for greater ferry travel restrictions ahead of the May long weekend? And what is your response to concerns about outbreaks in remote communities like the one in Alert Bay being caused by travelers?
I spoke with, let me start with the Alert Bay question first. I spoke with Chief Don Zavik last night. I spoke with Mayor Buchanan, who was himself diagnosed with COVID-19 last week. Spoke with him last week. And Dennis had not left Cormorant Island. The virus found him. He didn't find the virus. And those very travelers that you refer to may well have been local residents who had left Alert Bay to go shopping in Nanaimo or Campbell River or Victoria and returned and brought the virus with them. So it's not just people from away who can contract the virus and then have it spread through communities. It's people within communities. So I'm reluctant to put restrictions in place for Canadians traveling, put restrictions in place for British Columbians traveling. Beyond what Dr. Henry has already said, if you do not need to travel, if your travel is not essential, stay home. And I think that if we adhere to those basic principles, we'll be fine. I am aware of island mayors having some significant concerns. I am an islander born and raised. I appreciate those concerns, and we'll be looking at it very closely. But the May long weekend is 1,000 years away as far as I'm concerned, based on my daily schedule. And as we get closer to the May long weekend, I'm hopeful that we will have a whole bunch of positive initiatives in communities that will put the ferry issue to one side. But I don't want to be dismissive about it, but it's weeks from now, and I'm living this day by day.
All right, thank you, everyone. That's all the time we have today.
Thank you.